The message that changed everything didn't come from a rival, a board member, or the press. It came from the one woman he thought he'd never hear from again. But a stronger hook would be this. A billionaire checked his phone on a freezing night and realized the only person asking him for help was the woman who disappeared carrying his past and possibly his future. Alexander Hayes wasn't a man who startled easily. At 39, he had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, negotiated deals across continents, and made decisions that moved markets, but none of that prepared him for the notification lighting up his phone at 11:42 p.m. as his driver navigated through downtown Manhattan traffic, the city glowing cold and distant beyond the tinted glass. Because the name on the screen wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. Olivia Bennett. For a second, he thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe an old thread resurfacing or some glitch pulling ghosts out of his contacts. But then the message preview appeared, simple, direct, and unlike anything he had ever received from her before. We need shelter tonight. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words. And somehow they carried more weight than any business proposal he had ever read. His thumb hovered over the screen, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years. Because Olivia Bennett wasn't supposed to exist in his world anymore. Not after the way she vanished 5 years ago without a trace, leaving behind unanswered questions and a silence that no amount of success had been able to fill. He opened the message fully, expecting more, hoping for clarity, but there was nothing else, just that one line and a location pin that pulsed faintly on the map. Central Park, near a quiet stretch that tourists rarely visited at night. Alexander leaned forward, his voice cutting through the quiet luxury of the car as he told the driver to change direction immediately, his mind already racing ahead of the vehicle, piecing together possibilities that didn't make sense. Because Olivia had always been strong, independent to a fault, the kind of woman who would rather disappear than ask for help. And yet here she was, reaching out in the middle of a cold March night when temperatures had dropped below freezing, when most people were already inside, safe and warm. The car pulled up along the curb near the park entrance, and before the driver could even step out, Alexander was already moving, the sharp air hitting him as he stepped onto the pavement, his expensive coat doing little to block the sudden chill that seemed to settle deeper than the weather itself. He followed the path indicated on his phone, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across empty benches and bare trees, until he saw them, and in that moment, everything slowed. Not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because he understood it too well. Olivia sat on a park bench, her posture tense, her coat pulled tightly around her as if it were the only barrier between her and the cold, and beside her were 2 small figures, children bundled close, their heads resting against her shoulders. Alexander stopped a few feet away, his breath visible in the air, his mind struggling to catch up with reality. Because nothing about this scene fit the life he knew, and yet there it was, undeniable and raw. And as one of the children shifted slightly, lifting their face just enough of the light to touch it, Alexander felt something inside him drop, something heavy and irreversible. Because in that brief, fragile moment, he saw a reflection he couldn't ignore, a resemblance that didn't ask for permission to exist. And suddenly the message on his phone wasn't just a call for shelter anymore. It was the beginning of a truth he wasn't ready to face. Alexander did not move at first, because moving would mean accepting that this was real, that Olivia Bennett was sitting 10 feet away from him on a freezing night with 2 children who should not exist in his life. And yet there they were, small and quiet and impossibly familiar. The wind brushed through the park, carrying a sharp chill that made one of the children curl closer to her, and that single movement snapped something inside him, pushing him forward step by step until the gravel beneath his shoes made a faint sound that finally drew Olivia's attention. She looked up, and for a brief second, her expression was not guarded or distant or defensive. It was something else entirely, something like exhaustion mixed with relief, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by the composed distance he remembered too well. "Alexander," she said softly, as if testing whether his name still belonged in her world, and hearing it after all these years felt heavier than he expected. He stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough now to see the details that time and distance could not erase. The same eyes, the same quiet strength, but also something new, something worn down by years he had not been part of. His gaze shifted, almost against his will, toward the children, and now there was no mistaking it. The resemblance was not subtle or imagined. It was precise in a way that made his chest tighten. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, even at such a young age, details that mirrored his own reflection in ways that logic could not easily dismiss. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice steady but lower than usual, controlled in the way he handled high-stakes negotiations. But this was not business, and the silence that followed was not strategic, it was personal. Olivia's hand instinctively rested on the shoulders of both children, pulling them slightly closer as if shielding them from something unseen, and that gesture alone told him more than any answer could have. "They are mine," she said, carefully choosing each word. And for a moment, it sounded like the end of the conversation, like a boundary placed firmly between past and present. But Alexander did not step back, did not look away, because the question had already been asked in his mind, and once it existed, it could not be undone. One of the children looked up at him then, curiosity overcoming the quiet stillness, and their eyes met in a way that felt unfamiliar and deeply familiar at the same time, a contradiction that made his thoughts scatter. "It is too cold out here," Alexander said after a pause, his tone shifting, less confrontational now, more certain, the part of him that solved problems taking control. "You should not be here like this." But Olivia shook her head slightly, not in disagreement with the statement, but with what it implied. "We did not have another option tonight," she replied, her voice calm but carrying a weight that suggested this was not the first difficult night she had faced. Alexander exhaled slowly, the visible breath fading into the night air as he glanced around the nearly empty park, the contrast between this scene and the life he had been living just minutes ago almost unreal. And for the first time in years, the control he prided himself on felt uncertain, because this situation did not follow any rules he understood. "You reached out to me," he said, his eyes returning to her, searching for something she was not giving freely. "After 5 years of silence, you sent that message. Why now?" And this time, Olivia did not answer immediately, her gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again, and in that brief hesitation, Alexander realized something far more unsettling than any explanation she could offer, because whatever the reason was, it had been strong enough to break a silence she had protected for years, and that meant this night was not just an accident. It was the beginning of something neither of them could control. Alexander felt the silent stretch between them, not empty but heavy, like it was carrying words neither of them was ready to say. And for the first time since he arrived, he noticed the smallest details that made everything harder to ignore. The way Olivia's coat was not thick enough for a night below 30 degrees. The way the children's shoes were worn at the edges. The way their hands stayed tucked close to their bodies, as if they had learned to conserve warmth without being told. This was not temporary discomfort. This was something deeper, something that had been building long before tonight, and it unsettled him in a way no financial loss ever could. "You should come with me," he said, more firmly now, not as a suggestion, but as a decision already made in his mind. "I have a place nearby. It is warm, safe. You can stay there tonight and figure things out in the morning." And for a brief second, it seemed like Olivia might accept, her eyes flickering with something close to hesitation, but then it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by that same guarded distance. "We cannot," she replied quietly, and that word alone shifted the tension again, because it was not refusal, it was limitation. Alexander narrowed his gaze slightly, trying to understand what she was not saying, because nothing about this made sense, not the message, not the situation, not the invisible wall she kept placing between them. "Cannot or will not?" he asked, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal the frustration he had been holding back. And this time Olivia exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air as she looked away for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "It is not that simple," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something heavier than before, something that suggested layers he had not yet uncovered. One of the children shifted again, and the small movement drew his attention back. The little girl looking up at Olivia and whispering something. Too soft to fully hear, but one word came through clearly, Mom, and the way she said it, natural and certain, anchored everything in place. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger but out of realization, because the truth was no longer a distant possibility, it was standing right in front of him, breathing in the cold night air. How old are they? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost careful, as if the answer might confirm what he was already beginning to accept. Olivia hesitated again, and that hesitation was enough, but she still answered, they just turned 4, and the timeline aligned too perfectly, leaving no space for coincidence. Alexander looked at the children again, really looked this time, noticing the way the boy held himself, the quiet alertness in his eyes, the way the girl leaned slightly toward her mother, but kept glancing back at him with curiosity. And in that moment, a thought formed so clearly that it felt undeniable, and once it existed, it refused to be ignored. Olivia, he said slowly, her name carrying more weight now than it had just minutes ago. Are they mine? And the question did not echo, did not linger in the air the way he expected, because the answer was already written in everything he had seen, in every detail that refused to be coincidence. And yet he still needed to hear it, needed her to say it, because without her words, this reality would remain suspended between doubt and truth. And as the cold wind passed through the park once more, Olivia closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering the strength to face something she had been avoiding for years. And when she opened them again, there was no distance left, only a quiet, unavoidable honesty that changed everything without a single dramatic gesture. The answer did not come immediately, but it did not need to, because in the space between the question and her response, everything had already begun to shift. Olivia looked at him, not with fear, not with hesitation anymore, but with a quiet acceptance that felt heavier than any denial she could have offered. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost calm in a way that made the truth land even harder. Yes, she said. And that single word carried 5 years of silence, 5 years of distance, 5 years of a life he had never known existed. Alexander did not react the way most people would expect. There was no sudden movement, no raised voice, no dramatic expression, just a stillness that settled over him as his mind tried to reorganize everything he thought he understood about his own life. Because in one moment, the past had rewritten the present, and the future had changed shape entirely. His gaze shifted to the children again, no longer searching for resemblance, but recognizing it, accepting it. And with that recognition came something unfamiliar, something he had never had to process before, a sense of responsibility that was not chosen, not negotiated, but undeniable. You left, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, not accusatory, but filled with a question that had waited years to be asked. You disappeared without telling me anything, and now you are telling me I have children I did not know existed, and the weight of that reality settled between them, not as conflict but as truth that could not be undone. Olivia nodded slightly, as if she had expected this moment, as if she had replayed it in her mind more times than she could count. I know, she replied, and there was no defense in her tone, no attempt to justify or soften what had happened, just acknowledgement. The boy, Noah, shifted closer to her side, his small hand gripping the edge of her coat, his eyes moving between them with quiet awareness, while Lily watched Alexander more openly now, curiosity, replacing uncertainty, as if she sensed that something important was unfolding even if she did not fully understand it. Why? Alexander asked, and this time the question was not about the children, it was about everything else, about the years that had been taken from him without explanation, about the life he could have known, but did not. Olivia exhaled slowly, her breath trembling slightly in the cold air, and for the first time since he arrived, the composure she held so tightly began to show small cracks, not breaking, but revealing the strain beneath. Because staying would have destroyed everything, she said quietly, and the answer did not clarify anything. It only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to a story he had not been allowed to hear. Alexander frowned slightly, trying to connect the pieces, because nothing about that explanation aligned with what he remembered, with who they were, with what they had been. Destroyed what? He pressed, his voice firm again, needing something concrete, something that made sense. But Olivia shook her head, just once, a small movement that carried more refusal than any argument. "Not here," she said, glancing briefly at the children before looking back at him. "They do not need to hear this." And that was the moment Alexander realized something else. Something just as important as the truth he had already uncovered. Because whatever had happened in the past was not just complicated, it was still unresolved, still present, still influencing the choices she was making right now. The cold wind picked up again, sharper this time, and Lily instinctively leaned closer to Olivia, her small fingers tightening around her sleeve, and that simple gesture cut through everything else, through questions and tension and unfinished explanations. Leaving. Only one reality that could not be ignored. They were still out here, still exposed to a night that was growing colder by the minute, and whatever answers he wanted would have to wait, because some things could not be delayed. Not anymore. Alexander made the decision before he fully processed it, because standing there any longer felt impossible. The cold pressing in, the weight of everything unfolding too fast to control. "This conversation is not happening here," he said firmly, stepping closer now, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You and the kids are coming with me." And this time, Olivia did not immediately refuse. But she did not agree either, her eyes searching his face as if trying to measure something deeper. Then his words. That hesitation became the first crack in the wall she had built, and Alexander saw it clearly. "You reached out to me," he continued, lowering his voice slightly, but keeping it steady. "That means you trusted me enough for this, so trust me enough to get them out of the cold." And for a moment, everything held still again, until Noah shifted and quietly said, "Mom, I am cold." His voice soft but cutting through every layer of tension like it did not belong to any of their conflicts, only to the reality of the moment. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something had changed. Not completely, but enough, just for tonight, she said, and those 3 words felt like the first step into something neither of them could take back. Alexander nodded once, and immediately signaled his driver, who had been waiting nearby, and within minutes, they were inside the warmth of the car, the sudden change in temperature almost overwhelming after the freezing air, Lily letting out a small breath as she leaned back, her body finally relaxing for the first time. But the warmth did not ease the tension between Alexander and Olivia. It only made everything sharper, more real, more unavoidable. As the car moved through the city, Alexander glanced at the children again, and this time there was no distance left in his thoughts, only a growing certainty paired with a question that refused to settle. Because if they were his, then everything about the past 5 years had been built on something incomplete. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked again, quieter now, but more direct. And this time Olivia did not avoid the question, but before she could answer, her phone suddenly lit up in her hand, the screen reflecting in her eyes for just a second before her entire expression changed, not into fear, but into something tense and alert, something that immediately caught Alexander's attention. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharpening instinctively, but Olivia locked the screen too quickly, shaking her head. "It is nothing," she said, but the answer came too fast, too controlled. And Alexander had spent his entire life reading people, recognizing when something was being hidden. "That was not nothing," he replied, his tone firm again. And this was the first escalation, the first clear signal that whatever she had been protecting was still active, still close, still affecting them now. Olivia looked out the window, avoiding his gaze, and that silence confirmed more than words ever could. Then, as if the night had not already shifted enough, Lily leaned slightly forward from her seat, looking directly at Alexander with innocent curiosity, and asked, "Are you coming with us now?" And the question, simple and unfiltered, landed harder than anything else, because it carried an assumption that had not been spoken yet, that he was not just helping them for one night, that he belonged in whatever came next. Alexander held her gaze for a moment, caught between what he knew and what he had not yet accepted. And in that instant, something inside him settled, not fully understood but undeniable, because this was no longer about the past or the mystery or even Olivia's silence. It was about what stood in front of him now, and whether he was willing to step into it completely. The car continued forward through the quiet streets, but inside, everything had already begun to change in ways none of them could reverse. The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street lined with tall buildings, their windows glowing softly against the night. And within minutes, it pulled into a private entrance where everything felt controlled, warm, and far removed from the cold bench they had just left behind, but the distance in miles did not erase the tension that had followed them inside. Alexander stepped out first, then turned, offering a steady hand, not as a gesture of formality, but something more deliberate, something that acknowledged the shift that had already taken place. And this time, Olivia accepted it without hesitation, her grip light but real as she guided Lily out while Noah followed closely beside her. Inside, the lobby was quiet, polished marble reflecting the soft lighting. And for a moment, the children simply stood there, looking around with wide eyes, taking in a space so different from what they had just experienced that it almost felt unreal. "You are safe here," Alexander said. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that carried weight. And it was not just for them. It was for himself too, as if saying it out loud made it more true. They moved quickly through the space and into a private elevator, the doors closing with a quiet finality that sealed them off from the outside world. And as the elevator rose, the silence returned, but this time it was different, no longer filled with questions alone, but with anticipation, because whatever had been avoided outside could not be delayed much longer. When the doors opened, they stepped into a penthouse that felt expansive and still, the city stretching beyond the windows in every direction, lights scattered like distant stars, and for a brief second, even Olivia seemed caught off guard, not by the luxury itself, but by how far removed it was from the life she had been living. "You can stay here tonight," Alexander said, gesturing toward a seating area, already signaling discreetly for staff to prepare warm drinks and blankets. His actions efficient, but not detached, every movement grounded in a focus that had shifted entirely from business to something far more personal. Lily moved first, stepping cautiously onto the soft rug, her small shoes leaving faint impressions as she looked around, while Noah stayed closer to Olivia, his eyes more observant, taking in details quietly. Olivia remained standing for a moment longer, as if crossing. Fully into this space required more than just walking forward. But eventually, she did, and with that step, the distance between their two worlds felt smaller, but not simpler. Alexander turned back to her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer controlled in the way he presented himself to everyone else. "We are not avoiding this anymore," he said, his voice calm but firm. And there was no resistance in her this time, only a quiet readiness that had been building since the moment she sent that message. She nodded once, then glanced briefly at the children, who were now settling into the warmth, their earlier tension easing slightly, and lowered her voice. "There are things you do not know," she said, and this time, the words did not feel like deflection. They felt like the beginning of something she had held back for years. Alexander stepped closer, not impatient, but focused. "Then tell me," he replied, and the simplicity of that response made everything else fall away, leaving only the truth that had been waiting beneath the surface. Olivia drew in a slow breath, steadying herself, and for the first time since he had seen her again, she did not look like someone trying to protect a secret. She looked like someone preparing to finally reveal it, and as she began to speak, the past that had been missing from his life started to take shape in a way that made one thing immediately clear: whatever had separated them before was not over. It had only been waiting. Olivia did not rush her words, and that alone told Alexander this was not a story she had ever told before, at least not completely, because every sentence seemed measured, not rehearsed but carefully chosen, as if each detail carried weight that could not be taken back once spoken. "The night I left," she began quietly, her eyes not avoiding his but not fully steady either. I already knew I was pregnant. And even though Alexander had already reached that conclusion on his own, hearing it, confirmed in her voice, shifted something deeper, something more permanent, because it was no longer a possibility, it was a fact that had existed for years without him. He remained still, listening, not interrupting, not pushing, because instinct told him this was not something that could be forced, and if he wanted the truth, he had to let it come at her pace. I was going to tell you, she continued. That was always the plan, but before I could, someone came to see me, and that single sentence changed the direction of everything, turning what had felt like a personal decision into something external, something influenced. Alexander's expression hardened slightly, not in anger, but in focus. Who? He asked, and this time she hesitated longer, not because she did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real again. Your father, she said finally, and the name landed heavier than expected. Not because it was shocking, but because it connected too many things too. Quickly, his father's expectations, his control, the quiet pressure that had always existed behind the scenes of his success. Olivia continued before he could respond, as if she needed to finish before losing the strength to do so. He told me that if I stayed, if I told you about the pregnancy, it would ruin everything you were building, that you would be forced to choose between your future and a life you were not ready for. And the words did not sound exaggerated or dramatic. They sounded precise, like something she had carried unchanged for years. Alexander exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed it, because it was exactly the kind of logic his father would use, not cruel on the surface, but calculated, in a way that left no room for alternatives. And you believed him, Alexander said, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Olivia nodded slightly. I believe that if I stayed, I would become something you had to manage, not someone you chose, she replied, and there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet acceptance of the decision she had made. The room felt still around them, the city lights beyond the windows distant and irrelevant compared to the weight of what was being said. Inside, so you left, he said, completing the thought, and she nodded again. I left so you would not have to choose. And for a moment, that reasoning hung between them, both selfless and devastating at the same time. But then Alexander's expression shifted, because something did not fully align. That explains why you left, he said slowly, his voice sharpening slightly. But it does not explain why you never came back, why you never told me, after everything was already built, after nothing could have stopped me anymore. And that question carried a different kind of weight, one that reached beyond the past decision into the years that followed. Olivia's gaze dropped briefly, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her eyes now, something more complicated, more uncertain, because it did not end there, she said quietly, and that was the moment the truth deepened again. Because whatever had started with his father had not been the only reason she stayed away. And as that realization settled in, Alexander understood that the story he was hearing was only part of something much larger, something that had been shaping their lives long after she walked away. Alexander did not speak right away, because the moment Olivia said those words, everything inside him shifted from confusion to something far more precise, a growing awareness that whatever had kept her away was not just a decision made once, but something that had followed her, something that had continued long after she left, and the controlled world he had built suddenly felt incomplete without understanding it. What do you mean it did not end there? He asked, his voice lower now, not demanding but steady, as if he already knew the answer would not be simple. Olivia glanced briefly toward the children, who were now sitting on the couch wrapped in warm blankets, their small bodies finally at ease, their quiet presence grounding the moment in something real and immediate. And then she turned back to him, the hesitation in her expression no longer about whether to speak, but about how much to reveal. After I left, I tried to start over, she said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of memory. I moved to a different city. I stayed away from anything connected to you. I thought distance would be enough. And for a moment, it sounded like a clean break, like a decision that could hold, but the way she paused again told him it had not been that simple. But it was not, she continued, and her eyes shifted slightly, not avoiding him, but focusing on something beyond the room, as if replaying moments she had tried to forget. There were calls, messages I did not understand at first, people asking questions about you, about your business, about where you were going next. And that detail changed everything again, turning a personal separation into something far more complicated, something that extended beyond just the two of them. Alexander's expression hardened, not with anger, but with clarity, because he recognized that pattern, not from his personal life, but from the world he operated in, where information was valuable and connections could be used in ways that were not always visible. You think someone was using you to get to me, he said, and it was not a guess. It was a conclusion forming in real time. And Olivia nodded slowly. At first, I was not sure, she admitted, but when the questions became more specific, when they started mentioning things I'd only heard from you, I realized it was not random. And the realization settled between them with a quiet intensity, because it meant her absence had not just been about sacrifice, it had been about protection. Alexander exhaled slowly, his mind moving through possibilities, through names and connections and decisions made years ago that might have created something like this without him ever knowing. So you stayed away to protect me, he said, and this time, there was no question in his voice, only recognition, and Olivia nodded again. And to protect them, she added softly, her eyes moving briefly toward Noah and Lily, and that addition carried even more weight because it meant every choice she had made had been shaped by something larger than herself. The room felt quieter now, not empty, but focused, as if every piece of the past was finally aligning into something that made sense, even if it was difficult to accept. And tonight? Alexander asked after a moment, his voice steady again. What changed tonight? And that question brought them back to the present, back to the message that had broken 5 years of silence. Olivia's expression shifted slightly, not guarded, but more serious, more immediate, because whatever it was, it is not distant anymore, she said quietly. It is here, and I could not keep them safe on my own. And that was the second shift, the second realization that raised the stakes beyond anything he had expected, because this was no longer just about the past or hidden truths. It was about something active, something that had followed her all the way to this moment. And as Alexander stood there, looking at the woman he had lost and the children he had just found, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had been kept in the shadows was now part of his life, and walking away was no longer an option. Alexander stood there for a moment longer, the weight of everything settling into something sharper, more defined, no longer just confusion or shock, but clarity. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that had not been there before. Then you are not leaving, he said, not as a demand, but as a decision that had already been made. And Olivia looked at him, not surprised, not resistant in the way she had been before, but cautious, as if she understood that stepping into this would change everything again. Alexander, she began quietly, but he did not let her finish, not this time, because hesitation had already cost them years. No, he said firmly, his tone steady but unyielding. Whatever this is, whatever has been following you, you are not facing it alone anymore. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any argument, because it was not built on emotion alone. It was built on a resolve that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. Olivia held his gaze, searching for something that might not hold, something that might break under pressure, but she did not find it. And that made the moment more difficult, not easier, because trust was not something she had allowed herself to rely on for a long time. You do not know what you are stepping into, she said, her voice softer now, but still grounded in reality. And Alexander nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without stepping back from his decision. You are right, he replied. I do not, but I know this, they are my children, he added, his eyes moving briefly toward Noah and Lily, who were now watching quietly from the couch, sensing the importance of what was being said, even if they could not fully understand it. And you are the woman I should have fought harder for, he continued, his voice lowering just enough to make the words feel more personal than anything he had said so far. So whatever this is, it is mine to face too. And that was the moment everything shifted again. not because the problem was solved, but because the direction had changed. Olivia looked away briefly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the emotion she had been holding back. And when she looked at the children again, something in her expression softened, not completely, but enough to show that the decision in front of her was no longer just about survival. It was about whether she would allow someone else to stand beside her again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of choice. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet honesty that had not been there before. "This is not something you can fix overnight," she said, and Alexander nodded. "I'm not trying to fix it overnight," he replied. "I am making sure you do not have to carry it alone anymore." And that distinction mattered because it shifted the expectation from control to presence. Across the room, Lily leaned slightly against Noah, her eyes still on Alexander. And in that small, unguarded moment, something simple and undeniable passed between them. Not a full understanding, not a complete bond, but the beginning of one, something that did not need explanation to exist. Olivia noticed it too, and that was what finally broke the last layer of resistance. Not his words, not the situation, but the quiet connection forming without effort. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Just for now," she said, echoing her earlier words, but with a different meaning this time. Not temporary in the same way, but open to something more. Alexander did not push further, did not demand more than that, because he understood that this was not a moment for control, it was a moment for patience. And as he stood there, looking at the life that had been hidden from him for so long, now unfolding in front of him, he realized that the real story had not been about what he had lost, but about what he was willing to build from this point forward and somewhere beyond the walls of the penthouse. Whatever had been moving in the shadows was still out there, still unresolved, but for the first time it was no longer something waiting for them. It was something they would face together. Experience one of the most powerful, touching stories where a billionaire CEO's perfect life is shaken in a single night when he receives an unexpected message from the woman he once loved. What begins as a simple request for shelter quickly unfolds into a deeply emotional journey filled with secrets, sacrifice, and a hidden family he never knew existed. In this unforgettable, touching story's narrative, the strong and guarded single mother is forced to confront her past while protecting her children. As the successful billionaire must face the truth about love, responsibility, and the life he unknowingly left behind, set against the cold streets of a city and the warmth of a world he built. This touching story's experience explores the contrast between power and vulnerability, wealth and hardship, and the emotional weight of choices made years ago. As the story unfolds, long-buried truths emerge involving family pressure, unseen threats, and the reason behind a disappearance. That changed everything, making this one of the most gripping, touching stories you will hear, with emotional twists, heartfelt moments, and a powerful connection between a father and his children. This touching story's journey reveals how fate can bring people back together when they least expect it and challenges whether love can survive time, distance, and secrets that refuse to stay hidden. Character 1. A 39-year-old white American billionaire CEO, tall, sharp jawline, confident expression, wearing a tailored dark overcoat and suit, clean hairstyle, standing upright, front-facing camera angle, realistic lighting, cinematic style, no cartoon. No CGI, no illustration, no cartoon character 2. A 28-year-old white American single mother, soft but tired facial features, natural beauty, light skin, slightly messy brown hair, wearing a worn winter coat and simple clothes, front-facing camera angle, realistic lighting, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon.